Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session on an introduction to the ODI Fellowship Scheme. My name is Sasha Kapadia. I'm the Director of Global Advisory here at ODI. I am the head of the Fellowship Scheme. I'm very privileged to be able to lead this program for the past 6 months, so fairly new to it. I am joined by an esteemed panel of former fellows who will give you a bit of guidance and insight into their fellowship experiences, but also my longstanding champions of the scheme, my colleagues, Susan Barron and Darren Lomas. Susan and Darren, would you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Darren. I've worked on the fellowship scheme for well over 10 years, so I've got a lot of experience in recruiting and placing fellows, and so I've seen a lot of the things that they go through over the many years.
Hi, my name is Susan Barron. I'm the program manager for the fellowship scheme. And I've been in this job for even longer than Darren. So I've come across most of the issues that fellows experience and questions that they have. And kind of I focus a lot on the sort of fellows in country, how they're getting on, general well-being and stuff as part of my role.
Thank you, Darren and Susan. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our alums who will be joining us. For a bit of housekeeping at the outset, we're going to give a very brief presentation, an overview of the fellowship scheme, and then we're going to hear from our alums, and then you'll have quite a bit of time at the end to ask questions. Please ask your questions in the Q&A. The chat has been disabled for this webinar. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A and we will get to those at the point in the webinar when we're ready to. So don't hesitate. No question is too basic or too complicated. So with that, I will introduce our fellows. First, I'll start with Ashna Jamal, a former fellow in the Ministry of Finance at the Budget Department specifically in Timor-Leste from 2018 to 2020. She's now a macro fiscal advisor for the Premise 2 program at Adam Smith International. Ashna, can you say hello?
Hi, thanks for the introduction. Really happy to be here and speak to people who are interested in the ODI Fellowship Program. I'm also actually currently working in Timor on something with Yang, who will be introduced soon. So still have a connection with Timor and I'll talk about that later.
Okay. Next, I'll go to Adria Ruiz Rodriguez, former fellow Ministry of Trade, Industry and Tourism in Somaliland from 2019 to 2021. He's now a PhD candidate at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. Can you say hi, Adria?
Hi all, and thanks for the introduction, Sasha.
And last but not least, we have Yang Liu, a former fellow in the Ministry of Education at oh my gosh, in Somaliland. No. Sorry, guys.
Timor-Leste.
Yang, can you just fill in, please?
Sure, I will do. So I was a fellow between 2019 and 2021, based at the Ministry of Education in Timor-Leste. As Ashna said, I'm also working a project here right now. So yeah, the connection is strong.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yang. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and present a very brief presentation on the fellowship scheme. I believe everyone can see my screen, so I'm going to keep going. So what is the ODI Fellowship Scheme? The ODI Fellowship Scheme is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. So we have a long history of providing very quality technical assistance to host institutions, public sector institutions all over the world. It is a demand-led partnership between ODI and its partners. It's a win-win. Governments benefit because they get high quality and high caliber junior professionals to fill key skills gaps in lower and middle income countries. And fellows benefit because they have this really tremendous opportunity to work in a local civil service for an extended period of time on a 2-year contract. It was established in 1963. We've partnered with over 40 countries and an additional 10 or so regional and international organizations. We've placed over 1,300 fellows. Fellows have gone on to do incredible work in the public sector, at multilaterals, in civil society, in business. Fellows go on to really storied careers of all kinds. And the current list of fellows are Ethiopia, Ghana, Malawi, Namibia, Pakistan, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Solomon Islands, Somaliland, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, Timor-Leste, Tonga, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Zambia. There, as you can see, the breadth of geographies that the fellowship covers is quite extensive. So all the way from the South Pacific, and in the next batch, we're looking at the Caribbean. So it's quite impressive. Why do host governments want ODI fellows? Well, simplistically, it's because they provide a lot of value. ODI fellows contribute to stronger institutions. They help strengthen internal systems of a ministry. They improve national and subnational policies, working in close coordination with their colleagues. They bolster networks and build coalitions. So as a fellow, there's an interesting insider-outsider relationship that one has. And because of that, there's an ability to work quite effectively with the broader development stakeholders in a particular country and facilitate that needed collaboration. They enhance the work culture of an office by bringing their own experience, their own insights, their own personalities to their work environments. And most importantly, they advance mutual learning. So I want to stress that this is not a one-way transaction. Fellows gain a tremendous amount by exchanging and learning from their colleagues at all levels during their fellowships and in their countries of posting. And the learning goes both ways. Colleagues who may not have had access to particular trainings or particular methodologies benefit from everything that the fellow brings in their role. What's in it for a fellow? Well, it's a unique and immersive experience. If you're interested in international development, there's really nothing like it. The ODI Fellowship Scheme is exceptionally well organized by ODI, but it's also, we also take a bit of a backseat. The host institution that employs the fellow is the entity that manages that individual on a day-to-day basis. And so it really allows for a person to experience life and work in a foreign country and to be treated to the extent possible as a local. And so in that sense, it's an opportunity to develop personal and professional skills that you wouldn't get elsewhere. And as evidenced by the countries where fellows are currently posted, but also our alums on the line, there's an exposure to different geographies and countries. Interestingly, Yang and Ashna are somehow both in Timor at the moment, but we've seen fellows go from essentially one country to another country because they like the intensity of being in a different culture, in a different environment. What do ODI fellows do? Well, they do many things, but just to give you a snapshot of the broad share of work that is on their, in their portfolios, many are placed in ministries of finance or planning or at central banks. So that's where not a majority, but a large proportion of our fellows sit in those institutions. We send fellows to a number of line ministries, so health, education, agriculture, environment. That makes up a healthy chunk of our posts. And then you see trade and industry, statistics, and then other. What do ODI fellows do on a day-to-day basis? So policy analysis is first and foremost what they cover. So they help analyze data and information to solve problems. This can involve macroeconomic analysis, sectoral spending analysis, and helping to respond to crises by being quite nimble and agile and thinking about response. System strengthening, finding ways to make systems work more smoothly. So fellows often come, fellows come directly from master's programs, but they also come with a bit of work experience. And so in that respect, they take their very practical skills around budget, around finance, accounting, and help implement those sorts of tools, those sorts of methodologies and systems in their jobs. And lastly, they help, as I mentioned earlier, build networks and communicate complex ideas. So if a particular ministry is looking at trying to increase foreign direct investment, they'll help advise on trade policy, advise on how to better create an enabling environment for foreign investors. They'll help facilitate and advise on how best to work with external technical assistance providers or external stakeholders in the development sphere. How does it work? So as I said, the fellowship scheme is exceptionally well organized by ODI because we are the facilitator of the scheme. We are responsible for selecting candidates, for identifying posts along with host institutions. We prepare a pre-departure briefing, which is a week long that takes place in our office in London. And then we oversee the administration of the fellowship scheme throughout the 2 years. So we facilitate salary payments to the fellows. We help with flights. We provide medical insurance, and the fellowship scheme is funded by a number of different donors. And so we make sure that we are providing timely reports on the progress of the scheme to our funders. And last, but most important, we provide duty of care to our fellows. So fellows are scattered all over the world. It's our responsibility to ensure that they are safe and that their well-being is cared for. And so we provide safeguarding and security services to advise and guide on all sorts of issues and any challenges that may arise. What does the host institution do? So the host institution, in coordination with ODI, identifies the fellowship post where a fellow will be placed. So that includes drafting of a job description. And this job description is developed and outlined before a fellow even gets the job, frankly. The host institution manages the fellow on a day-to-day basis because the host institution is the employer of the fellow. It extends the same conditions of service as locally recruited staff. So that's often a local salary component that then ODI tops up to have consistency across fellows all over the world. They ensure ODI fellows receive work permits, and they provide the day-to-day duty of care in the workplace. So ensuring that there are no workplace incidents. What is the fellow responsible for? So the fellow is responsible for doing their job, doing their work to the best of their ability, and showing up day to day and being as collegial and effective as possible. They're supposed to follow the rules of the host institution and promote the interests of the host institution before a fellow's own. Ultimately, the fellow is accountable to the needs of the host institution. And of course, they have to be a good colleague. So they have to show respect to colleagues. They have to be appropriately deferential. They have to actively listen and behave with humility, because a fellow is, as I said, has this interesting insider-outsider relationship with the position. And so it's important to be appreciating and acknowledging all that a fellow doesn't know, as well as sharing thoughts and guidance and lessons that could add enhancements or improvements to the status quo. Who are we looking for? We're looking for postgraduate economists and statisticians who can apply their skills practically. This is the legacy profile of a fellow. If you do not have a master's in economics or in statistics, don't be alarmed. If you have a public policy background or a development background or an econometrics background, please consider applying to the fellowship scheme. We're looking at individuals who have hard skills, but also the right nature and spirit to take on the fellowship scheme. Relevant work experience is obviously a plus, and the right personal qualities, resilience, humility, adaptability, and the ability to be culturally sensitive are prerequisites. We encourage applicants from all nationalities. So despite the fact that there is a legacy tie of the ODI Fellowship Scheme with the UK government, and FCDO is our largest funder, we are open to individuals from all nationalities. And we encourage applications from LGBTQ plus communities and disabled candidates as well. How to apply? Apply online. We go to our website at ODI, and the application will be up in a matter of days, frankly. And for any inquiries, please reach out to our general inbox, fellows@odi.org. With that, I will stop sharing. Susan and Darren, would you like to add anything, given your experience with the scheme? Anything overview side?
I think that was well covered. Just to mention that we're open now for applications. So
Yes.
Yeah, as soon as anyone wants to apply. Well, I think a few have started already.
Great. Thanks, Darren. Okay, I'm paying attention to the chat, and perhaps it's best for us, I'll address one question about applications. If you can apply as many times as you want. There's no limit on the number of times that you can apply. And in fact, we often hear that fellows go through the process multiple times before being selected. So do not be discouraged if you do not get a placement this year. But without further ado, I think it's really important for us to hear from our alums, and perhaps they can give us a bit of an insight or an overview into their experiences. Ashna, we'll start with you. We'll go to Adria then, and then to Yang. And then we have a couple of questions that we hope will kick off a discussion amongst you all, and then we'll make sure to reserve at least 20 minutes for questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Sasha. Very excited to be here and speak to a lot of people who might be potentially doing the fellowship in the coming year. So I'll dive right in about what are the things. So how I want to structure this is I'll talk about the things that I loved about the fellowship, what were the things that were difficult, and how to think about those going forward. So I was in the budget department in Timor-Leste between 2018 and 2020. And right as I came in, we were in the middle of a state budget, and I was assigned the task of doing the budget book. This was at a time where I did not know Tetun, which is the state language, and my boss didn't speak English. So it was quite difficult right away to be in that position. But what I learned, and what I would advise to anyone who's going to do the fellowship, is give yourself time. You will eventually get there, and you'll learn what the local customs are, what is expected of you, and how to go about it. So at least a solid 5 to 6 months before you start fretting that the fellowship isn't working for you or you're not the right fit. Because what eventually ended up happening was I learned the basics of the language after learning how to communicate with my boss, which I practiced over time. I was able to understand the structure of my department, what the political legacy was, who did not like whom, what the political issues were, and how to navigate those. And the fellowship ended up being very interesting. So I ended up working on a broad amount of things. So for example, my main job was doing the budget for the country, so which was quite a big job, and I was in the position to basically allocate money to different line ministries, advice on that, and then later on in the year, once the budget was passed, also look at budget execution. At the same time, Timor has been looking at a host of public finance reforms. And as an ODI fellow, I ended up working with different development partners. But as Sasha mentioned, on behalf of the Ministry of Finance, I was able to steer a few conversations and also contribute to them, all the while remembering that I was representing the Ministry of Finance's interests. So it was always an interesting position, because sometimes people who are in other development partners might think that you're a foreigner, so you're not on their side, but at the end of the day, you're on the ministry side, so you're always navigating that. So ended up working on a bunch of different things. And what that has done is, really, I continue to work on public finance and social sector financing. So it really helped me understand what the nuts and bolts of the processes are in a Ministry of Finance and in line ministry. And I think what the fellowship gave me was that sort of groundwork, which I continue to use in the different jobs that I do even today. So yeah, overall, it was a really great learning experience. And I was really trusted, which was was a really good place to start. But it's not really necessarily the case for all fellows, because sometimes in certain fellowships, you're the first fellow in that position. So you have a lot of trust building to do. And different people have navigated that in their different ways, maybe something Yang can speak about. But I'll speak about some of the things that didn't fully work, which were, you have to realize that you're working in places which sometimes have fraught political environments. So when I came in 2018, the 2017 election was just closing down. So we thought things were going to be very different, and there would be a lot of direction based on which the budget process would move smoothly. But it did not move smoothly year on year. So for example, in 2021, I was doing the budget, and instead of doing it once, I had to do it thrice, because there was a political deadlock in the parliament, which was quite frustrating. But it also meant, being in that position also meant that I got to work on a host of different things. So I think whoever wants to do the job, be prepared that there'll be challenges, and there's no set POR. You'll be doing things which are outside of what you imagine you'd be doing, but they all can be interesting. And there's a lot of scope, especially in different governments, where they trust you to outline your own PORs, and basically on a day-to-day basis, you have the power to suggest something you find interesting. So I think that's something that you don't necessarily get to do in a consulting job. So I used to work as a public policy consultant for 3 years before. So enjoy the challenges, because they're also opportunities. And lastly, I would say that basically take your time if you decide to go for the fellowship and land in country. Everyone feels bad for some time, not knowing what the language is like, not knowing what the political dynamics are in office, but you eventually learn them. And once you get to that point, you start enjoying your fellowship. So yeah, good luck to whoever ends up doing it this year.
Thanks so much, Ashna. Adria, can we hear from you?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I have some slides with some pictures that might help get a sense of so let me see if you can see it. Can you see ODI Fellowship script? Okay. Okay, so hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Adrian. I was an ODI fellow between 2019 and 2021. And I was a fellow, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, at the Somaliland Ministry of Trade, Industry and Tourism, and I'll just talk about a bit of the experience, so that you get a bit of a sense of how was it doing the fellowship there. And I think that it will resonate a lot with what Ashna mentioned. Before that, maybe a bit of an overview. So you might not be familiar with Somaliland. That's because it's a non-recognized semi-autonomous state, officially part of Somalia, where the main language is Somali, religion is Islam, and it has a population of about 4 million people. It has one of the lowest GDP per capita in the continent, and its economic structure is based on pastoralism, although there are relatively recent dynamics as the country is emerging as a potential logistics hub in the region. As mentioned, I was posted at the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Tourism, which had the basic mandate to design and implement policies along these 3 areas. So basically the trade policy, the industrial policy, and the tourism policy. And apart from this, its mandate included coordinating private sector actors with a strong focus on MSMEs, and also building the whole sort of tourist infrastructure across the different sites that are in Somaliland. Later, there were some reshuffles, and the industry sort of element was moved to the Ministry of Investment, and therefore it basically became, after a year or so, the Ministry of Trade and Tourism. Now, what I think might be useful to look at is the types of sort of work streams that I was engaged in. It's not, of course, the only things that I did. So there were different sort of things coming and going, but I would say that these were the 4 main sort of stable work streams or areas of work where I was engaged. So first, we started conducting internal surveys in the ministry that were internally developed and were meant to inform policy. So for instance, we did this cross-border trade survey in the Somaliland-Ethiopia border in the custom post of Tokwajale, which then fed into the trade policy. Second, we also developed together with my supervisor training material and conducted workshops as well as training, a sort of training course that ran for about a month. And third, and related to that, we spent a lot of time also with my supervisor in trying to sort of establish, harmonize the procedures to collect, treat, clean, share, analyze, and report the administrative data that the ministry was collecting. And eventually we also got to start reporting this not only internally for the minister and other department directors and cabinet as well, but also externally for other stakeholders. And finally, I was also involved again with my supervisor in trying to sort of improve the internal organization of the ministry. So basically coordinating with different department directors to establish an annual strategic plan as well as 3-year strategic plans for the ministry. So basically, I just wanted to go through these also to highlight maybe 2-3 takeaways. The first one is that I was, as you can see, not engaged in very technical, sophisticated work in the sense of using very advanced statistical software like Python or running modeling or so on, which meant that there were other types of skills that were very important, namely soft skills. And second, that although we are all replaceable, this is of course not about me or so on, but it was quite rewarding to see that the ministry was able to produce outputs that before my predecessor or myself were not being produced. And again, it's not about us, but certainly I think that the fellowship contributed to the ministry starting to produce these types of outputs. And of course, this can be very rewarding. Also take into account that the ministry was sort of set up in 2017. So it was a combination of joining the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and hence why there was need for a lot of sort of building the internal organizational capabilities of the ministry. And yeah, finally, that some of these work streams, as Sasha mentioned, there is a strong element on sort of long-term sustainability and not building dependency on fellows. So I think that with my supervisor, this was quite clear, and we tried to work on things that could sort of have a long-term impact and that could also be sustainable over time, regardless of the fellowship. On the other hand, when it comes to life, in Somaliland, we live in a compound, which in a way made it easier to mingle with other foreign workers because there were events and other things being organized. And most importantly, I think it's also a great opportunity to learn about the culture and about the history of not only the country, but also the region where you are. So for instance, in the case of Somaliland, they have one of the oldest cave paintings in the region, Lasgel, and also, if I'm not wrong, what is the oldest mosque in the continent. And finally, as Asna mentioned, I think that that's rewarding, and as it can be, and considering all the advantages that it also has challenges. One of them being living abroad for some time in a sort of socioeconomic setting with which you might not be very familiar. And yeah, I would just encourage everyone to know what the fellowship is about, as in the whole package, because in a way that also will strengthen your application, because I think, well, Darren and Susan and the team can speak more about it, but they also want to know that you know what you are getting into and what are the advantages, but also what are the challenges. So yeah, these are the points that I wanted to raise, and I wanted to basically speak about. Happy to take questions later. Thanks.
Thank you, Adria. I'll turn it over to Yang.
Thanks very much, Sasha. So I guess I'll probably start by saying I think the fellowship is really personalized in terms of the experience. Even though you're a cohort of different fellows and, you might be in the same country, I think everyone has really, really different experiences in terms of how they experience the fellowship. One of the things that was mentioned earlier was this sort of insider-outsider situation. And certainly, I think it's the case when people expect to go into development, they see sort of development projects, they see donors acting. But the ODI Fellowship is a really interesting way of being actually able to see what ministries think internally in terms of from the other side, in terms of, how do people feel about donor projects and what sort of makes a donor project successful, what the ministries actually want to do. And in part, you get involved with the internal politics of everything. So that's also a really interesting thing to have. I should flag, so I was a fellow between 2019 and 2021 in Timor-Leste with the Ministry of Education, where I was sort of the first fellow who was placed in the ministry in the country. So in that role, you do have a lot of priority setting in terms of what do you want to achieve with your time. And so you have a lot of freedom in terms of how to progress with your role in terms of, do I want to focus on sort of more technical work? Do I want to focus on more strategic work? Do I want to work on more sort of holistic problems? And so that's a really interesting thing. I worked as the education advisor to the minister. So I think like a lot of ODI fellows, you end up being thrown into quite a senior role, even if you have sort of experience. It's sort of like working very closely with ministers, with director generals, and you typically report to, for example, director general or director in your given ministry. So it's always, you play like a really central role in either the budget setting or in analysis, and you're sort of seen as, I think, the go-to person over time as you develop your role and as people start to trust you a bit more, that you're sort of the person who sort of analytical work goes to, or you can set the direction of the ministry in terms of how we think about evidence or how we think about data. And so that's really, really important. I guess one of the things I worked on in the Ministry of Education here was quite interesting in that at the time when I'd started, sort of COVID kicked off about 6 months later. And so myself and another fellow, Julia, we were in charge of supporting the analytical support to a grant that went to the Global Partnership for Education. And with that, we were able to secure a $3.5 million grant for the ministry in this education sector in Timor-Leste, which, funded loads of things such as distance learning, water and sanitation later on in the year, as sort of support for COVID continued. So you end up really having a lot of important projects, and you end up being a really central role in the ministry. But of course, that's so the role you play is very much defined by what you choose to do. On the fellowship itself, I think, you really get to sort of work in a flexible way. And I think when people think, oh, we work in a flexible way, no, you don't know it until you actually work in a development country in a ministry. So I used to work in the UK government, and certainly, there is a lot of nice things about having set processes, and you know what to expect. You know what to expect when you email someone. You know what to expect when you send a project off. And in a lot of the settings that ODI fellows are placed in, I think that sort of expectation of the sort of the known and expected is sort of gone out of the roof or gone out of the window, and you deal with problems as they come up. So you really learn on how to deal with situations differently, how to deal with unexpected situations. And also, I think you realize over time as you work in ministries how important personal relationships are. And I think personal relationships go on to drive a lot of work in terms of how successful your implementation is, in terms of how you work with different colleagues. And that's something I think you learn over time on the projects and on the fellowship, where you pick up relationships and you do a lot of work after. As Ashna said, also, there are set TORs, of course, but as you can imagine, in sort of in circumstances where things are moving quite quickly and things are unexpected, you end up also doing a lot of work that perhaps isn't on your TOR. Some of them can be more administrative. Some of them can be really high level in terms of, oh, can you go meet the ambassador for this problem? Or can you go sort out, this like huge looming issue? So all of that is sort of like, you learn to deal with it on the job, basically. And I'll just say, I think, the experiences really give you sort of a different perspective on how to work in developing countries, in terms of how to work with different people in different settings. So at the moment, Ashna and I are working together in Timor, where we currently both are, on education budget support to the Ministry of Education. So we did this last year. We had a pretty good outcome in terms of getting a 40 million increase for the ministry's budget. And so this year we're focusing on how to execute that properly. And so really, like without the ODI Fellowship, I wouldn't have met Ashna and we wouldn't be working together. So there's a lot of, relationships also within the ODI sort of network. And I guess I'll just say, I think development's a pretty small place. So you always end up running into ODI fellows like, oh, have you met this person or have you met that person? And I think really the ODI Fellowship gives you quite a unique way of entering the sector if you've not had that experience before. And is also a great way of going to a new location which you might not have heard of or you might not have sort of explored before. And so it gives you a bit of a sense of purpose in terms of like you go somewhere to work on a problem and you sort of develop relationships over time, and you continue to work well, and you run into different people in all sorts of life. So it's a pretty unique experience, and I think it has been particularly valuable in terms of both personal and professional development. And lastly, I'll just finish with I think the team based in London and the fellowship team is manages a huge sort of portfolio of different teams and different people in different countries. And the sort of the management stance is, of course, a little bit more hands-off in terms of fellows get to have more autonomy in their roles. And I think that works well with fellows, and that's sort of the preferred option of most fellows. But in the second year of my fellowship, I had a bit of a personal issue with my family in terms of them having some health issues. And Susan, Darren, and Robin at the time were super, super supportive and really, really helpful. So I think even though it's a bit more of a hands-off program, the support is really there if you go and reach out for it, at least in my experience. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Sasha.
Thanks, Yang. We are very much on time. I said that we would leave 20 minutes for questions. I know Susan, Darren, and myself have been answering questions that have come through the Q&A, but I think I'll take this one question and hand it over to the alums. How easy was it to integrate into the culture and community of your host country? Ashna mentioned a little bit about language skills, so particularly with regard to feelings of safety and language barriers.
Hi, I can take that one. I think it really depends on where you're placed and who you're working with. So at the same time, within the same director general, I had 2 other ODI friends who were working with a director who spoke English, and a lot of the people in their department spoke English. So their integration to that extent, I mean, for them getting to understand what the work was like was much easier. But in my department, it took me a lot more time. But because I learned the language and I was communicating in that and I was making jokes in that, I ended up fostering different kinds of relationships with my department, which go on till now when I go and visit. And people are, I think, relatively happy to see me, but also like relatively happy to help me when I'm working on different projects. I think then when it comes to, and also when Timor in particular, you know, there are certain cultural cues you only understand by living here. So for example, when 2 people are standing in the corridor, it's rude to walk in between them. So if you come in, like on the very first day, in the first 6 months, you might not understand these small cues. So you have to be kind to yourself to make certain mistakes. But I think at the same time, there is a lot of your first few months should be spent asking people about what their about what's going on. And I think sometimes some fellows make the mistake of thinking that, you know, they're here for the job and all of this other stuff is ancillary, but I think it's a mix of everything. In terms of safety, again, I think it depends on which place you're in. In Timor in particular, I mean, I came from New Delhi, which was much unsafe for women, and I felt it to be pretty safe, which is kind of sad, I guess. But then for my experience was very different. I think as a brown woman, maybe I fit in much more in Timor when I was on my motorbike. But like I know a lot of my colleagues who were white had different instances of eve teasing, maybe especially in the evening. So I think for women in particular, I think it's unfortunate that women have to adapt to different places that they live in, and then they manage their time accordingly, whether they're not going out too late or they're going out late, but with friends. But I would say, what I would say is understand the place that you're in, understand who your friends are, what your timings are like, and make smart decisions. And I think, again, unfortunately, women have to do this in many of the places that they live in. So I would say that it's no different. But again, depends on the fellowship country, and take your time to understand that from your colleagues, especially your local colleagues, and make smart decisions. Sorry, that's a bit of a bummer, but I think needed to be said.
I think that's the realistic answer. Yang, Adria, would you like to come in on that question? Or we can move on to the next one.
Yeah, I'll chip in. I think on sort of fitting in culturally, you know, it's really about sort of how open you are to the experience itself. And so I think it, like Ashna said, if your focus is purely like, I'm here to work and I will do task 1, task 2, and then I will go home, then, you know, I think that's probably a little bit less of an enjoyable experience. I think, you know, you just have to show that you're putting in a bit of effort. So, you know, my language skills aren't great right now, but like when I started the fellowship, I think I spent a few weeks taking courses in languages, which ODI had helpfully funded. And I think, you know, after a week, people were like, oh, wow, you're really trying. And I think I still have friends from that sort of period when I was learning the language that I still have today, even sort of 4 years later. So it's really just about keeping an openness in terms of being able to relate with people and, you know, being to new experience. And on safety, I haven't had many issues. Of course, Ashna has had, but again, that sort of, I know can be prevalent with female colleagues. And so it was really about sort of making smart decisions. And certainly, you know, that's part of what the fellowship trains you for, right? You're placed in a different environment and you have to learn how to deal with situations as they come up in a smart way. So yeah, I'd say just like sort of same as Ashna, sort of be open, but also have a bit of a smart sort of streetwise sense about you.
Great, thanks so much, Yang. There's another question in the Q&A asking about relationships with colleagues. So, you know, the perception is that the ODI fellow is sent abroad as an expert of sorts. And so how does this contribute to the work environment? And does it help or hinder collaboration with colleagues? Perhaps, Adria, we'll start with you.
Yes, thanks. Very good question. I think it relates to the other question as well. So the more you, I mean, first, we are not experts, I would say, in a way, right? We might know other things, but we are not someone with 15 years of experience. And sometimes, at least in my case, there was a bit of the expectation to deliver on things that, it's important to be humble and say, look, I might not have a particular specific expertise on this, but we can work on it together and do our best. So I think that it links to the idea of being, humble and also being honest with what you can do and what you think that you might not be an expert in a way. No, so I think that this links also to what has been mentioned early. So basically building a good rapport with your colleagues so that they. I think that at the beginning this might be the case that they may see you as an expert consultant or something like this, but as you develop your relationship with them, I think that it helps to understand better how you can fit and be effective in that organization.
Great. Ashna or Yang?
Yeah, maybe I'll chip in a bit. I think it's also really like working with colleagues. It's really about sort of understanding what level you're pitching your work at, right? I had a really good manager, like when I was in the UK government, who told me your work is only as good as those people who understand it. So certainly, like, it's, of course, like when you go in, one of the purposes is for capacity development. And so if your expectation is to go in and run like a R or Python model immediately and be like, oh, I'm just going to hand this over, that's probably not going to work. So I think, get to know people on a personal level. And I think this was helpful for me in terms of being able to work with people successfully. Understand what they want to do and understand how you can support them in targeting that and sort of directing people a little bit towards what you think would be helpful. But it really is aligning sort of how your work style approaches sort of the people that you work with, right? And I think if you're coming from two different perspectives entirely on like you trying to implement a hugely technical thing and everyone else being like, how do I open Excel? You're not really going to get to a middle ground. So I think just have sort of like a conversation about where you want to be, and it's something that you figure out over time. But most people, I think most fellows do it successfully.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly add on that it's very important to have a certain level of empathy when you're dealing with your colleagues, because I think one of the things that a lot of ODI fellows have to contend with is that people are not going to be as motivated, especially because you're working with people who have been in the civil service for a lot of years and they're not as well paid as you are. So if you're being paid 10 times more and you're new to that environment, you're obviously going to be more interested in doing things than they might be, which might feel very frustrating at first. But I think when you couch it in terms of how frustrating the civil service is in most countries, you understand where they're coming from, because most ODI fellows are there for, say, 2 years or with an extension 3 years, but then these people have been in these positions for much longer. So I think understanding where they're coming from and the issues that they have to deal with are very important, and also understanding where you can help them. So in certain, like in places like Timor, people will often not voice a difference in opinion with the director. But you are in this unique position sometimes where you can, even though you just come in. So it would be quite, it would be good for an ODI fellow to understand what are the concerns of the team and be the spokesperson if they can, also to understand what their colleagues need. So for example, I wanted to drive a lot of different things in my department, but people were just not interested. And then we did a simple analysis of, okay, what do people want? And what came up was that people just wanted English classes, which was not really what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something with Excel. So we ended up doing the English classes. And off the back of it, we formed a few good relationships. And we had some colleagues who on another occasion, I could ask them to do something, and maybe grudgingly so they might help out, which they wouldn't have done without those English classes. So I think really take the time to understand what people want and also be prepared to fail, because these are difficult, intractable problems. Civil service reform is difficult in a lot of countries, and you don't want to change that in your 2 years. So what you can change is basically forging a personal relationship and helping people achieve what they might want. And I think that's where you could be the most useful.
Thanks, Ashna. I think it's an important point that you raise about kind of managing expectations all around, right? And so I heard, Yang and Adria mention, R and Python programming languages. And so maybe the thinking going in would be that, you would be implementing some complicated model, but, a basic Excel training might be what is needed in that particular environment. So perhaps it would be useful to speak to the breadth of the work that you all do. So it could be that you are doing something that requires quite a bit of skill or familiarity with, economic modeling, but you could also be giving English classes. So can you speak a bit to that? Anyone? Yang, Adria, Ashna?
Yeah, I can start. So, I mean, I was in a bit of a unique position in terms of being in the cabinet of a minister. So a lot of the work that I did was came from all over the ministries. I typically, if ODI fellows placed in a directorate where they have a specific person to report to. But my role alongside one of the other fellows, Julia, we had a pretty interesting sort of overview of the entire ministry in terms of course, everything comes to the ministerial level and then the minister signs off or the minister decides on what to do. So, it works on a variety of things one day we were sort of assessing the national curriculum in terms of exam results. The other day we were doing grant applications and then coordinating donors in terms of who's doing what, how we aligned, what is the overall strategy. And another day we'd be working specifically with 1 or 2 people to train a little bit on Excel. So really most of our roles, I think, as I said earlier, it's sort of you can't necessarily plan all that well. And I think it would be a mistake to try and plan for 3 months, I'll do this and exactly what I'll be doing. Because usually something happens along the way and then you get slightly derailed. But it's often not a bad thing because you end up having a lot of interesting experiences. So I guess to sort of sum that up, I'd say in my role, I had a bit of analytical work, a bit of sort of coordination work, a bit of strategy work in terms of reviewing strategic documents, in terms of looking at, what is the education sector plan for the next few years. And as that was an official document by the bank, the World Bank. But as a ministry staff, you're able to sort of review that and you're able to give feedback on sort of what you think a sensible thing would be to do for the education sector, for example, in the next few years. So lots of high profile work, and it really is quite varied. That's my experience. Maybe Adria, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I can come in. I totally agree that there are different things that you do sometimes on short notice on the fly. And but yeah, in my case, maybe something that I can highlight is that I had an excellent supervisor who was also the head of the Department of Planning of the ministry. So I think this speaks to the fact that our fellowships are quite specific, and precisely because I was working with him and he knew what had to be done in the ministry because he was the head of the Department of Planning. That meant that in a way it was easier to sometimes sort of a streamline work that was a bit more long-term oriented. So I think that while you might be doing things on the fly or on short notice, at the same time you might have also the opportunity to have some stream of work which is a bit more stable and that allows you to work more towards sort of long-term goals.
I think my experience was similar. I think there were in the budget department, you follow the budget cycle quite closely. So you have to do the budget. Then once the budget is passed, you execute it. Before that, you field questions from Parliament. But other than that, you also end up doing a lot of varied things. For example, the ministry wanted to do a public expenditure review. So we ended up doing that with the World Bank. So you also in a lot of high-level meetings with development partners where you're commissioning studies on the behalf of the government. And I think that one thing to note there would be, development partners want to do things with the government based off whatever their lock frame is. But sometimes the ministries have very different needs. So I think ODI fellows are in a unique position to maybe translate some of the government needs to development partners. It's also important to, and a bit of a segue is, it's also important to, since we are nearly ending, is that, everyone's going to want a piece of you because ODI fellowships are in ministries and they know that ODI fellows have a high level of trust. So there might be someone from a certain bank who might ask you for the latest GDP numbers before they're published, or there might be someone who might want some insider information. So I think it's very important to realize the position that you're in and be strategic about what you're sharing and not sharing, because there are certain cases where you end up saying something which might lead to a possible leak, which can be problematic. So remember that this is a position that comes with a lot of responsibility. The governments do trust you. So while you're doing a huge plethora of things, there's an implicit understanding that you're on their team and not on the other team.
Thanks, Ashna. And perhaps one last question before we wrap up that came in through the chat, asking about how a fellow's previous experience prior to the ODI Fellowship and then the subsequent experience during the fellowship, how it all contributed to your career trajectory. So I think Yang touched a little bit on his path, given that he's still in Timor, but Adria, maybe it would be interesting to hear from you, given that you've now gone into a PhD.
Thanks. Yes, I had done some work in the Horn of Africa region with a specific focus on industrial development. So I think I was very happy to be posted at and I think it was quite aligned with what I did before at the Ministry of Trade and Industry, also in the region. And I've gone on now to do a PhD. I'm actually at SOAS, I transferred on industrial policy again. So I think that in that respect, both prior, I was maybe lucky, but both prior experience and the fellowship actually were quite aligned.
Now, Yang, do you want to come
in? Yeah, of course. So before I was a civil servant in the UK in the Department for Education, and I think in that sort of more structured environment, you learn sort of best practice and sort of, how should an Excel sheet be set up and how do you do a business case and how do you evaluate economic costs? So part of my fellowship was spent on sort of implementing part of that, like translating, let's not hard code everything here in Excel. Like that's a good thing to know. Or, like how do you look at the cost of benefit of this policy to sort of like mixed success, I would say. I think, yeah, like most people who have some sort of experience in terms of having been worked in the workplace before, like I wouldn't say like it's specifically required that you need to have worked in a certain background, but just some sort of ability to work with different people and sort of share some of the knowledge that you have in terms of, what is a good way of working or how do you communicate. And like often part of Ashna and my job now is bringing people together just to have a conversation in terms of, you work on this and you work on that, you two need to talk. And I think that's from my perspective, I think like the previous experience has fed in through that way. Ashna?
Yeah. So yeah, I used to work in a consulting firm for 3 years before I joined the fellowship. So I came at it knowing that I was interested in issues of resource allocation, public finance, and I wanted to work in a more of an implementation role. So when I landed in the Ministry of Finance, it kind of, my previous role as a consultant, I think the skill sets that I had were communication, maybe learning how to do things very quickly, and a certain level of analytical skills, and also a theoretical understanding of how Ministry of Finance or like a planning process or a budgeting process works. So I think what that helped me was like when I hit the ground running, I knew what were the right questions to ask. But having said that, being able to work on a tight deadline is not necessarily the most important skill when you're working in a government which has long timelines to do anything. So I think maybe my work as a consultant earlier actually left me a bit frustrated because I was used to working on shorter timelines and expecting things to be done much faster. So I relaxed and I learned what it is like to work in this government and then get along. And I think what I would say that the fellowship has given me is that I know who the right actors are in government, what the different roles are. Implicitly, like right now, I'm working in education financing with Yang. We'll be able to ask the right questions. Okay, maybe this person will know this and at least tackle those problems accordingly. So I think having a bit of experience earlier helps you maybe come in with a bit more confidence. And then being able to use those skills a little bit. But having said that, I had a lot of other colleagues for whom the ODI Fellowship was the first job, and they also learned along the way. So I don't think that having prior experience, not having prior experience is a deal breaker. You also learn skills differently. I think what I have ended up doing is I still work in public finance and, like, for example, climate financing or social sector financing, and still issues around budget execution and macro fiscal policy, for example, in the work that I do in Somalia. So it's helped me, and the fellowship helped me understand that this is the kind of work I want to keep doing. So that was my experience. I know a lot of people end up doing this and realize they want to do something radically different. So I think you should be open to all sort of possibilities after the fellowship.
I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up. I think openness is the key theme around going into the fellowship, but clearly getting out of the fellowship as well. I want to thank Yang, Ashna, Adria for joining us today and giving us a bit of a flavor of their experience during their fellowship experience. And thank you to Susan and Darren for providing their insight. I know we've been rapidly trying to answer questions in the chat. This has been recorded. We are going to edit it and it will live on the ODI Fellowship Scheme website. Applications are open. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to the team at fellows@odi.org. And we look forward to reading and receiving your applications. Thank you so much.